For this week's look at employment law in our Toil and Trouble slot, I'm joined by Shelley Eden, Director of Shelley Eden Law, to talk about a case that examined how the court views large companies as distinct from small companies when it comes to disputes around dismissal. Shelley, size matters.
Size does matter in this case, and I think there's some comfort in this decision for small employers that you're not going to be held to quite the same standard as a large employer. It's got to be a good thing.
Yeah. Now, tell us about this particular case that looked at this.
So it's a case of Mr. Singh. So he worked for ETU, the union, so it's a case against the union, and he was involved as a union, as a person working for the union, but he was also involved with the Migrant Workers Association. And in the middle of all of that, he kind of got caught up in something with an employer who was an employer who'd been criticised previously for potentially migrant exploitation, and in fact subsequently was as well. So this was a situation where it seems like he got a bit caught up. A couple of years after that, what happened with that employer, the employer actually complained about him, and one of the things she said was that he'd sexually harassed him. So the union, unsurprisingly, were concerned about this, and they started an investigation into what had happened, and that's where the criticism starts from the court in terms of how they carried out that process.
So what happened after that? So I believe they got rid of the sexual harassment allegations, or they just discarded them.
That's right. And so what Mr. Singh was able to do at his disciplinary meeting was show that actually the messages or part of them may have been created, and that he was actually genuinely caught up in something a bit like he was kind of under some form of attack, or someone was out to get him. He was being targeted in some way, and that seems quite a credible thing that he raised. And so what the union did is they just went, okay, well, we won't deal with that anymore. The difficulty with that is that allegation had come out into the public domain, and there was a news article about it, and the union didn't really act to correct the picture. The other thing they did is, obviously the union were very concerned about this from a PR perspective, and that's quite understandable, but they didn't get this nice, you need to be really clear about what your allegations are about an employee, and they didn't have clarity about that. So whereas, that concern about the public view of things and the optics of this was potentially quite a valid concern, but it doesn't seem like they raised that with him as being one of the reasons they were dismissing him. They carried out quite a short process. They suspended him quite quickly, carried out quite a short process, and just didn't do the level of investigation that could be expected of them.
I mean, it just blows the mind that ETU would do this. I mean, people working in migrant workers' rights are valuable, I would imagine, people who have understanding of that.
Look, absolutely. The thing was, in that situation, he'd got caught up with an employer. Yeah. So he went into this meeting to help resolve a dispute, but he was kind of on the side of the employer. I don't want to overstate that, because I genuinely think he was caught up in something. And so he was
an affair. Do you mean? Was he caught
up?
Oh
no, not at all. I think actually the employer kind of brought him on her side a little bit in these cases, and so in that sense, I get the feeling he was maybe outside of his expertise a little bit. Right. He chose the wrong team to sort of work for in this case. He also used union premises for the business of the Migrant Workers Association in that particular case, and so that was what the union was ostensibly concerned about. But really, it was just a bit of a mess. Like, some of what I'm saying is kind of speculation, because it's kind of like, well, that's what appears to be the case, and that's what it seems that they were thinking. But the point really here is they weren't as clear as they needed to be.
And they didn't do the due process, which
that's right.
They presumably tell employers all the time to do.
Well, and they would heavily critique employers who don't follow due process. I think they had some quite legitimate concerns about what was going on, and yes, in the rush to perhaps get to the end, which happens sometimes, they didn't follow the steps they needed to. They may have felt, because they would see themselves perhaps as a smaller employer, they may have not felt they needed to go to quite that nth level that employers do, but that's sort of the what's really interesting about this case is the court has said, well, no, actually, you can be expected to know about workers' rights in particular, and so you can be expected as an employer, ETU, to carry this out well. Yeah. And we do look at the resources available to the employer. This is what the court's saying. When we consider these things, we look at, well, actually, is this a small employer? Is this a sophisticated employer who can be expected to understand? And in this case, yes, they can be expected to understand the proper process and carry it out. I mean, I always feel sorry for employers who get caught up, because, they probably had some really genuine concerns about what was going on. Here was this person being caught up with an employer who was arguably an exploiter of migrants. It's very bad optics, and they wanted to act, and they needed to act. But it's a good lesson to, look, that's fine, but get your ducks in a row, do it properly, do it thoroughly, get your allegations clear. What is actually at issue here? What's at the heart of this? What are you really upset about? And make sure that that's what you investigate. And in this case, the sexual sexual harassment allegation, wasn't substantiated, but it wasn't kind of cleared up either, and it left a taint, for this man who, there's now a headline on the news about him and saying that he was accused of sexual harassment, where he was able to proceed. It seems fairly clearly established that there was no foundation in that. Yeah.
So his unjustified dismissal, that does leave a taint, as you say. What other redress does he have, if any?
So, well, he's got financial compensation. And he's won both in the Employment Relations Authority, and then the union appealed it to the court, to the Employment Court, which is unfortunately not a good decision in the end, because actually they've lost in the Employment Court as well. They obviously felt very justified in taking the action they did. And so I think this, in effect has cleared his name, this case, and he's received compensation. So he's had a pretty resounding victory.
Yeah. And the unusual part, as you say, was the fact that the judge said if you're smaller, we take a slightly different view of things.
Yeah, look, I think what the judge has done is shone a light on that part of the law. So that's in the law that says when the courts are considering the decision an employer has made, they need to look at the resources of the employer. And that's been there for quite some time. But it had a nice light shone on, which is to say, and in this case, we have an employer who was sophisticated, who can be expected to know. So we're going to hold them to a higher standard. So the good news is, if you are a smaller employer, you don't have an HR department, you don't have employment lawyers, you can, it's not that you're going to get away with less, but there's going to be less expected of you in terms both of process, but also in terms of your options for your outcomes. So that's really good news for smaller employers. And then for larger employers, I think they know they've got to get it right. And this is just a reiteration that, yes, if you've got special expertise in this area, i.e. you're a union, or you've got good resources behind you, i.e. you're a large employer with an HR department, then you've really got to get every part right. You've got to tick all the boxes really carefully.
Shelley, thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure, thank you.
For more content just like this and all the latest business and political news, head over to mbr.co.nz.